the fascists. So I remember as a small child, as a young child, I asked my father about his missionary work in Europe. And I asked him if he was able to convert any Jews. And he said, no, but they converted me. They helped me be a human being. So I said, well, I can see how you would be traveling in Germany, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, parts of the Soviet Union. And I could see how you would begin to relate more to the Jewish underground and the resistance than you would to your own brothers in Germany and other places that were trying to institute a form of fascism. But I said, something must happen to your heart as well. What was that, Daddy? And he said, well, our little group that was traveling all around Europe and going to the little underground churches joined up with a group of gospel singers, all from the South. And all the gospel singers were African American, people of color. So he said, I hadn't heard any English. I had been in the Soviet Union, in Russia, underground, in the dead of winter for 8 months, and I hadn't heard anybody from home. And when we joined up with the gospel singers, we talked about sliced tomatoes and okra and hot biscuits. And he said, we sang the same songs, we prayed the same prayers. And he said, one day I thought I was having a nervous breakdown because I forgot they were black. And he said, I tried to talk to myself about it and say, this is very important. You're a Klansman from Birmingham, Alabama, and this is very important. But he said it started happening so often that he decided to just let it go. While he said, I would forget about that while I was in Europe, because all the Europeans called us Americans. They didn't make a distinction between the black Americans and the white Americans. And he said, so I decided while I was over here, I'd forget about it, and when I went back to Birmingham, I'd be a good Klansman again. But he said, that ruined me as a Klansman. So my father went through this transition, and I didn't understand until I was an adult. And some of you here may have had a similar experience. I didn't know the emotional toll that it had taken on my father when he was disowned by his own father and his own mother. And his brothers never spoke to him again in his life because he had left the Ku Klux Klan and become a human being. So that was what was in my childhood. So that when the Civil Rights Movement started in my home state of Alabama, and I was able to meet Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, I was ready to participate in this movement and to try to do something. So I have my whole career. In fact, my first job was SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I was the first white Southerner to be a field secretary for SNCC. And my job was campus traveling. So for over 50 years now, I've done basically what I'm doing tonight. Campus traveling, talking to fellow organizers, talking to fellow brothers and sisters about our responsibility to take care of one another and unite across all these barriers. So we're going to talk about tonight, I hope, the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina. I've worked there now for 5 years. We've been bringing people together. The first time I was ever arrested was 57 years ago, yesterday. October the 4th, 1961. I believe it was 57 years ago. The last time I was arrested was maybe 3 years ago in the State House in Raleigh, North Carolina. 17 of us went to jail to try to save rural hospitals, to try to call attention to the fact that our state house, both the Congress and the Senate and the governorship, had been taken over by some real extremists. 17 of us went to jail, and we didn't know that anybody would follow us. And since then, over 1,000 people have been arrested in North Carolina. They've gone to jail to fight for bringing black and white together. 60% or more of those people who have gone to jail in North Carolina are white Southerners. My fellow brothers and sisters of the white persuasion have gone to jail. And one of the reasons is that a lot of the young people have become involved. A lot of the older people, my age or maybe 10 years younger, might have been very busy during the 60s, having families, being in professions and so forth, and now they feel they have an opportunity to take action. And that's what's happening all over the country now. It's happening all over the world. And we're still in this struggle about bringing people together or keeping people separate and making walls. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. How can we avoid making walls? How can we make bridges? And how can we communicate? So I learned one thing from Martin Luther King and Mrs. Rosa Parks and people like Fannie Lou Hamer that I worked with. And that thing that I learned is still resonated with me. And we'll have some time to talk about some of these stories. But they said that brotherhood and sisterhood is not so wild a dream as those who profit by postponing it pretend. So there's a lot of people that still want to postpone people coming together from different walks of life, from different political points of view, and getting together. Because a lot of people profiting on keeping us separate and keeping us angry with each other. And we're talking tonight about how do we communicate? How can we reach over across these divides? And if there's one thing that I can talk to white young people about, and some of the gray hairs also, it's our responsibility to do anti-racism work and all the other things that come with that. Women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and all of those things. It's our responsibility to work on those things. Thank you.
So we're going to spend the rest of the evening in conversation. So I have a few questions for Bob. And then at some point in time, we will turn it over for the audience to also share with us. Is this moving a little bit? Or is it all right? So Bob made mention of the fact that it was 57 years ago yesterday that you were first arrested. I wonder if you would tell us about that story.
Okay. I'll be very happy to tell you about that. It was an amazing day in my life. First time I was arrested. You always remember the first time you were arrested, right? And if you haven't been arrested yet, get arrested soon so you can remember that day. You know, I grew up in Alabama. And in Alabama, we always had a saying, thank God for Mississippi. And out west, you may have other states that are nearby and say, thank God for, I don't know, Idaho or whatever. But we were in Alabama, and we thought that we were at the bottom of just about everything, except Mississippi was worse. So when I first started working with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I didn't realize that my first staff meeting of SNCC was going to be in Macomb, Mississippi. And it was fraught with a lot of anxiety and terror. Because when we started our voter registration campaign in Mississippi, which is one of the most democratic rights that can be held by people in a democracy. Black people in Mississippi in 1961, if you tried to register to vote, you put your life on the line. And Herbert Lee was a black farmer around Macomb, Mississippi. And when he went down to register to vote, his next door neighbor, E.H. Hurst, a white member of the Mississippi legislature, followed him then down next day to the cotton gin in Liberty, Mississippi. Now get the irony, Liberty, Mississippi. And he followed his neighbor, Herbert Lee, down, and because Herbert Lee had was a black man and had tried to register to vote, he confronted him at the cotton gin and executed him, shooting him one time in the head, killing him instantly. So what SNCC did in those days is that wherever the danger was, that's where we went. Because everybody said at that time, you can't organize and you can't register people to vote in Mississippi. Well, we were young and brash, and we said, well, that's where we're going to go. If you can't do it in Mississippi, we're going to go to Mississippi. And one of the reasons we did that was that Dr. King understood, and John Lewis and other people who had started SNCC, that we had to take away the terror of lynching and castration, because that had been used since slavery times and all through the Jim Crow era to strike terror in the black community, that if you stepped out of line, you could be murdered, you could be killed, you could be lynched. So that's where we went, and that was my first staff meeting. While we were in the staff meeting, 135 high school students, some of them as young as 14 years of age, 12 years of age even. Brenda Travis was 16 years old. It was my first staff meeting, but Brenda Travis, who was 16, had already been arrested 3 times as a civil rights freedom rider. So when the students walked out and came to where we were in the SNCC meeting, they started making signs, and they were going to go and protest the murder of Herbert Lee and the expulsion of Brenda from their high school. And so that was when I had to face the question about what was I going to do. I was hired to go to white campuses and talk to white students about what's happening in the civil rights movement. But I also realized I would never be able to do that unless I was a real part of the organization. And I was also the only white person there. And I was the first white person on the SNCC staff. So when the students filed out of that Masonic temple in Macomb, Mississippi, and headed down to the city hall, I just fell right in line with them. And I'm sure I was one eyesore of an individual, the only white person in a group of 130-something black people. 2 other staff people went with us. As we approached the city hall, we were stopped by a mob of 400 or 500 people in the street. They had mobilized just instantly. Everybody had CB radios. The Klan was very well organized. They stopped us at the city hall, and the students began to stand up on the steps of the city hall and pray. And the police would come over and grab them and say, "You're under arrest," and drag them off to jail. Now, while that was happening, a little group of Klansmen gathered around me and began to hit me. They would hit me, and then they would look at the police and see, is it okay? And the police, who were also about the same as the Ku Klux Klan at that time, show that guy a good lesson. So they began to beat me, and both Chuck McDew and Bob Moses, both African-American SNCC staff, came over and stood between me and the people that were hitting me. That was the nonviolent method. If somebody's being attacked, you go and you don't attack the attackers, but you put your body so that you absorb some of the punishment. And the first time in my life I saw police with big sticks, big truncheons, hit people in the head as hard as you would hit that desk over there with a piece of oak. And the skin split, and the white of a skull showing through the skin. And you could see the swelling. The swelling came instantly, blood gushing. And I said to myself, if they do this to us on the steps of the city hall, what are they going to do when they get us in their jail? They dragged them off, and the little group around me started taking me out into the big mob, and the big mob was saying, bring him here, we'll kill him. Bring him here. And I knew that if they got me out there, they would kill me. So my father's preaching voice all of a sudden came in, and it said, God helps those who help themselves. So I was a little bit new to nonviolence because I had been a martial arts instructor in school. So I was used to fighting, and I was good at it too. I was also, don't tell anybody this, I was first dancer of the Montgomery, Alabama Civic Ballet. And you had to be in shape to be a ballet dancer in those days in the Big South. So I was in shape. They were going to drag me away and kill me out in the street. So I took hold of the rail that was down the City Hall steps, kind of like this rail. Oh, it was a very rusty rail. I took hold of that, and it totally enraged the people who were trying to kill me, that I would resist. And they would pull, and when they pulled, I would hold on. And when they came back to get another pull, I would move up the rail. And I had a very irrelevant thought. I said, hey, I'm winning this stuff. I was highly motivated, of course. Because if they pulled me loose, I'd probably die. So I worked my way all the way to the top of the steps. And they were so enraged that somebody from the back behind me came over the back of my head and began to put their fingers in my eye socket. And they were trying to get a hold of my eyeball, literally trying to pull my eyeball out of my head. And my martial arts training came back into focus, and I would wait until they almost got it between the thumb and forefinger, and I would move, and my eyeball would thunk back into my eye socket. Well, they eventually got so angry they piled on top of me, and the last thing I remember is a boot kicking me in the side of the head. My head was sticking out of this pile, and a big boot was kicking me in the side of the head. And the last thought I had before I lost consciousness was, this is the way that I die. And I thought that I would die that day. But I didn't. There was something else that I needed to do. So that's why I'm here tonight.
That's quite the good. So, in your book, you discuss this as your first arrest and your first outing as a member of the movement. But what was it? Was it pressure from within? Was it your own decision? How did you come to the decision that this was something that you needed to dedicate your life to?
Well, that leads to another story, mainly about Martin Luther King and Ms. Rosa Parks. When I was in college, I went to my church school, the Methodist College in Montgomery, Alabama, and I was a ministerial student, so I was going to be a minister, like some of you, or a missionary, or whatever. My grandfather on both sides, my grandfather on my mother's side and my father were both ministers. My older brother was a minister, so I was supposed to be a minister. But I was in sociology class. And sociology will get you in trouble if you take it seriously. And I was in an advanced class studying race relations. And we were given an assignment to study the racial problem and write a paper about solutions to the problem. So when 5 of us in the class said we were doing this honors thesis and so forth, Dr. Davidson, and we're going to go and talk to Martin Luther King, Dr. King, and Mrs. Rosa Parks, who made the Montgomery bus boycott. And they won the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 56. And so we said we're going to go and talk to them. And he said, well, you can't do that. And we said, why is that? He said, you'll be arrested. So as young sociology students, our sociological imagination was piqued by the idea that you could be arrested doing research for a paper. So we said to the professor, we're only doing a paper. We're not going to go demonstrate or something. And he said, well, you just don't know anything about race relations in Alabama in 1959 or 60, whatever it was. And we said, that's why we're in race relations class. So anyway, we decided that we would go anyway. And we even asked Dr. King. We went to the federal court and we found Dr. King because in those days he was usually in court. So we found Dr. King, and the 5 of us introduced ourselves, and we said, we're students from Huntington College, and we'd like to come to the nonviolent workshop that you're having at Reverend Abernathy's church. And we understand some people who are there from the Lunch Counter Sit-In movement, from SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he said, well, you're very welcome to come, but he said, you have to be prepared, you may be arrested. So we said, well, that's what our professor said. And he said, that's why he's a professor. He understands about things like that. So we said, well, we think we have a right to go, First Amendment and all that. And Dr. King said, okay, come ahead. You'll be very welcome. And so anyway, we did go to the workshop. It was an all-day workshop on a Saturday. And it ended with Dr. King preaching. So what student wouldn't go to hear Martin Luther King preach at Reverend Abernathy's church in Montgomery, Alabama, where the Montgomery bus boycott was successful? So we were pretty pumped about the whole thing. But at the end, Dr. King came over and he said, the church is surrounded, and the police have sent word that all 5 of you will be arrested. And I said, Dr. King, we need to escape. And he said, well, do you remember that little workshop we had that you might be arrested? And I said, well, I guess what I do mean is we need to try to escape. So he said, oh, okay, I understand. And he said, I tell you what I'll do. I'll go out the front door, and the police and the press that was running the church, if they all run around there to the front, Reverend Abernathy and Mrs. Rosa Parks can take you down to the basement, and there's a back door, and at least you can run for it. So that was the plan. So while we were waiting for Dr. King to go out the front, we were keeping an eye on the police and everything, Mrs. Rosa Parks, that quiet saint of Brandon, touched me on this elbow. I haven't washed that elbow since. And she said, Bob, when your students see something wrong, you have to do something. You have to act. You have to take some action. You can't study it forever. And I wanted to say, well, we just started studying, but that was my commission in the Civil Rights Movement from Mrs. Rosa Parks that said, you have to do something. So that was what really got me into going to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Because frankly, look, can I talk to the young people up for a minute?
Oh, yeah. We've got a few here.
Yeah. The students and the young people were the most militant in all of the Civil Rights Movement. And SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who has probably covered less in the history, had the largest staff. We went to the worst places, and we were dynamite. So that was what the young movement was about. And if they said you can't go somewhere and organize, that's where we went. That was our responsibility. So that was my introduction to the movement.
So I have a couple of questions that I think stem out of that I think are really important, especially as our young students and our students, young and of various ages, think about what their part to play is. And in Utah, with a predominantly white population, sometimes the issue is thought of as that's not our problem.
Yes.
So, coming from your background as somebody from the white persuasion, as you suggested, why is it still important for students today to, whatever their involvement may be it in social movements, be it in trying to change policy, what do you see? Why is it important for white students as well as students of color and different persuasions? Why is it important for them to get involved?
Well, that's a very good question, and the beginning of the answer to the question is that it's our responsibility as white people, basically. And I can see that there are a lot of white people here tonight. So it's our responsibility because of the effect that it's had on our national history, not just the South. So you can see that a lot of the things that are happening now really are at base based on racism and all of the accompanying things. Women's rights. I mean, when I was in school, I didn't even realize that women in this country only got the vote in 1920. So we have a country that's basically patriarchal, based on the genocide of indigenous peoples, taking their land and so forth under the doctrine of discovery, which is a Christian doctrine that if you're Christian and you find pagan people or non-believers, that you can confiscate their lands, their money, violate their women, take their property and so forth. So we have a country that was based on a form of genocide against the indigenous people. And then the capital was built by unpaid African enslaved people. So that's a history that we've never dealt with. So whether you live in Utah or anywhere else in the country, we're in a country that's pretty much governed by that. That's why we have a responsibility, number one, to educate ourselves on it. Because when I was in school, I didn't learn about the labor movement. I didn't learn about the women's suffrage movement. I learned nothing about the abolitionist movement. In my history classes growing up in the South, it was the war between the states. It had nothing to do with slavery. It had to do with the you Yankees up here or up there in New England oppressing poor old Southerners that owned people and had millions of acres of land. So this kind of history is what we have to deal with still. And that's why something could happen in what we call the second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, or the second Emancipation, where women got rights that they'd never had before. Black people certainly got rights that they'd never had before. We begin to be more progressive on a whole range of issues. And then to have, we never thought that anybody would try to go back to an all-white ballot box in the South. And now there's huge efforts to disenfranchise once again people based on their color, and even based on their age. In North Carolina, the voting restrictions were so severe, they wouldn't even let students who had student IDs issued by the state and so forth, you couldn't use that under their new laws of voting. So not only were women's rights challenged again, but voting rights were challenged again, and all those things. It goes back to a song that we have in the movement. Freedom is a constant struggle. So if you believe in freedom, we really have to struggle, and it's our responsibility, I think, to do that. And especially having to make up for the lack of our education and all those things. I never heard about, for instance, in history class or anything, the Lincoln Brigade. Did you ever hear of the Lincoln Brigade? It was brigades of people from our country, the United States, going to Spain before the Second World War, when they saw the rise of fascism, and Americans by the hundreds and thousands went to Spain to start fighting against the Nazis and fascism way before the Second World War. We never learned about that because that was mainly communists are doing that. That was socialists doing that. That was radicals doing that. So that's not included in our education. So we have to make up for our education. We have to learn about all these issues. And then we have to, as Mrs. Rosa Parks said, we have to take action. Do something.
So the old adage, especially about education, is that what we learn is that Rosa Parks sat down, Martin Luther King stood up and gave a few speeches, and yay, we're all equal and all is good. Right? That seems to be a lot of the education that we see today. And one of the pieces that I think maybe a lot of people, and maybe this generation in particular, I don't think there's a connection with this idea of nonviolence. Not nonviolence meaning not violence, but that it's a worldview, it's a way of thinking about things, it's an approach to direct action. Could you maybe school us on that a little bit?
Oh, I'll try. That was a complex, it involved several different issues there. But one of the issues is about nonviolence. And I wanted to get, maybe some of the questions and discussion we'll get into is about Antifa. What's the name of the group that is Antifa? Antifa, yeah. So there's still a debate inside the movement, the progressive movement, about nonviolence. But I firmly believe that since they have all the money, they have a lot of the money, they have all the weapons and so forth, that if we are to make a successful economic revolution in the United States, a moral and economic revolution, the way Dr. King called for in the Poor People's Campaign, he said, now that we've completed the civil rights movement, he said basically, along with Ella Baker, one of the great leaders of the civil rights movement, they said, Ella Baker always said it's about more than a hamburger. And Martin Luther King, who is now Saint Martin Luther King, the peaceful saint of good feelings and nonviolence, was a very radical individual. And he said that there was a liberal consensus nationwide to do away with the last vestiges of legal racism in this country, de jure segregation and so forth. We have to do away with that. So the 64 Public Accommodations Act, integrating public facilities and transportation and so forth was important. 65 Voting Rights Act was very important. And the Fair Housing Act that was passed after Dr. King was assassinated. That was a basic completion of the liberal consensus in this country, that we had to do that. That we're in competition now in the Cold War with Russia, and we call them the slave states of Russia, and we have people in the United States that are killed because they're black and they want to vote. We have people who were on a bus, and they set the bus on fire in Freedom Rides in Alabama, tried to hold the doors shut so that they would kill all the people in the bus. And why did they want to kill the people in the bus? Because they wanted to ride in the front seat. The black people wanted to ride in the front of the bus. And the black people and the white people wanted to ride together on the bus. And that was reason to be killed. So we had to have the end of that kind of racism in our country. So there was a liberal consensus that took us through all of that. And then Dr. King said, we now have to move to a thoroughgoing social and economic revolution. Because if you have a majority of people in poverty with not enough income, with poor housing, poor medical care, poor schools, no unions, so forth. We have to go now to a thoroughgoing social and economic revolution, and there was no consensus in this country to do that. And that's why there was a realignment of the political parties, because the Democrats had been the party of segregation, the party of racism, and the Republicans, the Lincoln Republicans, were the abolitionists. They were the people that were in favor of racial justice. But when Dr. King started the Poor People's Campaign and was assassinated, there was a bloodbath of leaders around this country. And in the same way that Reconstruction after the Civil War was defeated by violence, by killing all the black and white leaders of that fusion movement, the same thing happened after the Civil Rights Movement. Medgar Evers was murdered. John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, Kennedy brothers, were murdered. Malcolm X. Over and over again, you had the leaders being murdered. And there was a retrenchment and a determination by a large part of our government now and our politics to go back to racism. And it was the Republicans, through Reagan, opened his presidential campaign where? In Philadelphia, Mississippi.